Hi, I'm David Silverman, president of American Atheists. Bigotry is ugly in all shapes, forms, and sizes. But what some people do is they cloak their bigotry in what they think will make it look prettier. They cloak it in religion. They justify their bigotry with religion. They say, I'm a bigot against homosexuals, I'm a bigot against gays, but that's okay because God is too, and that makes my bigotry moral. It doesn't. Bigotry is ignorance. Bigotry is immoral. Bigotry is un-American, even if you think your God says so. What I hope is going to come out of this series with Dr. Jones is that people will understand that bigotry against the gay community is not in the Bible. It is in the believers who justify it by cherry-picking which Bible verses they can use to support their assertion. You can find phrases in the Bible to support just about any position, and unfortunately this includes bigotry and hate. We've seen too often in this country that believers sometimes pick phrases out of the Bible specifically to justify their bigotry or their hate to some group of people, the Jews, the blacks, the gay community, and none of it's moral and none of it's right. What I wish people would do is cherry-pick the phrases of the Bible that make them better people instead of the phrases that justify their bad behavior.
I think Christians should support the gay and lesbian community. I often cite 3 ways the Bible is misused to oppress gays and lesbians. 1, readers disregard historical context, which leads to misinterpretation. 2, they ignore evidence that the word homosexual is mistranslated. And 3, they overlook Jesus and Paul's big picture message that love supersedes law.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director of BJ Unity, the affirming alternative for alumni and students of Bob Jones University. And I'm also serving on the board of Safety Net, a new consortium of alumni and student groups from Christian colleges around the country. I'm here to tell you, if you're a student at one of those schools, or you're an alumnus or an alumna, and you're wrestling with your sexual orientation or your gender identity in the context of being a person of faith or a person who's struggling with faith, you're not alone. We know what that's all about. We've been there. We've done that ourselves. And we're here to support you. You're not alone. And God loves you just the way you are.
Hi, we're Alex and Kat from the Aristocrats podcast, and we just wanted to say that we're taking a stand against bigotry masked as religion, custom, tradition, or pseudoscience.
As humanists, we believe all people, regardless of sexual preference, sex, or gender, deserve to be treated with respect. Gay marriage and gender body identity discrimination are not moral issues to be decided by churches.
The ability to love who and how you want and to be ultimately free to be yourself inside and out are human rights for us all. Thank you.
My name's Christopher Mowdy, and I'm the host of Meeting of the Minds here on the New Covenant Group. I support LGBT rights, their civil liberties, and everything that derives therefrom. I really recommend that you watch The Place for the next couple of weeks while Dr. Jones illustrates how the concept of being against LGBT rights is not biblical. Because for those that are claiming that they're against it because of biblical reasons, you might easily see how wrong they are and how quickly Dr. Jones will disabuse them of that. Please join us.
This is the place to where we take our time, try to do things efficiently, and sometimes we fail. And so once again, we do apologize about our failures, that is being timely. And it has to do with various things. We're having problems actually with trying to get people on the same page quickly, that is to resolve technical issues, and so it is what it is. However, this morning is not about our problems with technical issues, but since this is such an important show that is on love is genderless, we wanted to make sure that our audio and video was extremely clear. And if we continue to have the kind of difficulties that we are having right now, I'm not going to be using my marker board at all. I'm going to keep it real simple. And so that's something that I had intended on trying to do a lot of analysis but I'm going to forego that until I'm comfortable with actually what we can do this morning in our studio. So, with that said, I'd like to bring Bob Graves into the conversation. Bob, how are you doing this morning?
Well, I'm doing fine. And looking forward to what we're going to be talking about, and hopefully it'll be something very good.
I think that it's going to be useful, but I have to be ever so honest about this conversation, and both of us are going to do a series on linguistics and non-linguistics and what all that means in the context of these kind of studies and chats, because I think that we fail miserably this morning to suggest that we are absolutely certain that we know actually what the Apostle Paul said, or if it was actually Paul himself actually writing this document. And the point that I want to make clear at first is that we are working with models, just like all of these different translations are synthetic models. That is, they're based upon synthetic translation theory. What we're doing this morning is also based upon modeling. It's like science. Science does this all the time. They develop artificial X, Y, and Z's, and they do model things efficiently, simply to, just for the sake of explanation. But we're not going to work on the same axis, if you will, as many other people have been doing. And so I'm suggesting that people actually make that note. What say you?
Well, certainly we don't want to. We want to get into a lot of that later. I think it would help a great deal. We've been complaining about translations for a long time, and we've been using certain words to complain about it. But I think it would be very helpful for us to take some time to explain what we mean by these words and what these dynamics are. It's kind of like if a medical doctor was trying to tell you why a certain procedure has to be done in a particular way, and all he does is give you doctor speak. You still don't know anything. But when a doctor might be able to take the time to explain to you in more common terms what he means by the problem he's running into, then you can finally understand and appreciate the problems the doctor's having with a particular situation. So I think it'd be very helpful for us to discuss some of the linguistic issues and problems, and discuss them just as linguistic issues and problems as they exist linguistically, and then recognize how this affects our approach to the text.
Right. One of the things that I wanted to do this morning was to go to the marker board and do some analysis. I'm afraid that that's probably not going to be able to be done. However, I would like to get started, that is talking about the English text, and let's work through a few English models. And I'm simply readjusting because of our technological difficulties here. But let's approach Romans 1 this way, just for a few minutes, and if things get worked out, we'll bump it up a little bit. Let's go to Romans 1 and read from the NIV, and I'd like to use three different English models, if you will. I would like to use the King James Bible, and oftentimes I say King James Bible instead of version, simply because it was never called a version until those in the West started articulating it that way. And so I'm going to say that I'm reading from that which has become a version, and I will also be reading from the NIV and also from Dr. Ann Nyland's work. Now, she has done extensive work that is in the New Testament. She is a lexical theorist, and the thing that I like about her work is she's not trying to throw theology at the gloss. That is in the context of doing things in transport, and I really appreciate that. And so let's just start the read for a moment and set up a premise for our chat, because this morning I want to do everything that we can to keep things simple and really support the gay and lesbian community. They need to know that they're loved. They need to know that they are completely normal, and no one needs to take theology and throw it at them and condemn them. And so hopefully we can help some of that. Mm-hmm. And so let's go to Romans chapter 1, and I'm going to be reading from the NIV to set the premise up. And I'm going to leave this chapter for a few minutes just to make a couple of points. But at first, I think it would be best simply to do just some general reading. In verse 1, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God, the gospel he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. Now, you and I would disagree with this rendering completely,
already.
but let's move on. And so, once again, we are simply talking about using models. And when Bob and I start talking, and when we can do the work adequately, we're going to, that is, using what we have in a fashion that would make sense to everyone, we're going to put these things on the table. But let's keep reading. Verse 3, regarding his son, who as to his human nature was a descendant of David, and who through the Spirit of holiness was declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Through him and for his name's sake we receive grace and apostleship to call people from among all the Gentiles to obedience that comes from faith. And you also are among those who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. So he goes a little bit further in verse 7. He says, this is actually to all in Rome who are loved by God. And I think that's a powerful point to make at first. My document, this thing that I'm trying to share with you, this would be to all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be saints. Now, I don't agree with the translation here. That is, the idea of these people being called saints. I think that's too much of a Christian mindset and not one of a textual truth. So
more like called to be unique, called to be themselves.
Yeah, called to be who they are. In other words, learning how to accept yourself. That's true. But I want to establish some things before we go too far, because I think that what people do is when they read chapter 1, they start feeling condemned, and then they feel like hell all the way through the text. And
the verse you just read here, Romans 1:7, is a verse that, as I read it, and of course we're going to try to stick to the English as much as possible here, this is a verse of inclusivism, and yet the context is written in a way that really, the way it's translated, where it's leaning in the direction of an us versus them.
Okay, I can't hear you, Bob. We're having these many difficulties, and so I'm going to ask you to repeat that if you would.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Barely.
Okay. What I was saying is that it's interesting. I mean, this verse 7 that we just read is a verse which really brings out the inclusiveness that's really intended in this particular text. And yet it's translated for us in a way where the rest of the text here is really setting up an us versus them in a manner that is, I think, synthetic, overly synthetic.
I agree. I'm still having a difficult time hearing you, but I think that I heard enough of you to say that I would agree. Now, just for the sake of establishing some of the possibilities of what this writer actually was saying, I'd like for us to turn a few pages, and let's look at chapter 8. Chapter 8, and let's look at verse 29. And we're going to keep this in English for a few minutes. It says, for those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son. Now, this is dealing with whoever God foreknew. Would you agree with that?
Oh, definitely. And unless he's got, unless he's not very aware, we could have some problems with this.
Now, I'm aware that the Calvinists like to get into these specialty meanings that really have nothing to do at all with what would be obvious in the text, but I'm not even going to make their argument. But let's just presuppose that this is just talking about, God knowing beforehand. And
right.
I'm not even suggesting that the Apostle Paul is even writing about a God that does exist. I'm very convinced that in most cases he's simply using the God term as a literary device. But in verse 29, those God foreknew, he also predestined. And so in this sense, we could say all of those he foreknew, he predestined. Would you agree with that?
Oh, well, sure. I mean, yeah, but of course, this word predestined is oftentimes used to talk about every aspect of time, whereas really, this is a word that's just talking about how it all ends up.
Right.
The culmination. Yeah.
Okay, so just for the sake of dealing with this particular gloss, if I say that everyone who is foreknown of God is also predestined, if I follow the trend of thought here, to be conformed to the likeness of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers, and those that he predestined, he also called. In other words, if you're foreknown of God, you're predestined. If you're predestined, you're also called. If you're called, you're also justified. If you're justified, you're also glorified. So if one were to read this document, and if this is actually what the writer intended for his audience to understand, would one conclude, oh, if he foreknew me, I am predestined. If I'm predestined, I'm also called. If I'm called, I'm also justified. If I'm justified, I'm also glorified. Would that be a fair conclusion?
I would think so, unless there's a little bit of a mental defect here. I just can't picture the God that Paul's talking about having this kind of a problem where there's certain individuals and God is going like, who are you?
Exactly. And so in a sense, Paul may be spinning this. He may be saying, God foreknows everyone. Therefore, everyone is predestined. Therefore, everyone is called. Therefore, everyone is justified. Therefore, everyone is glorified. So in light of this, what then shall we say in response to this? If God is for us, who can be against us? Because, many of these people had this kind of theology, God is against me, against me, against me. And this is why it's so important to read chapter 1 in the context, because the very next thing that he says in verse 7 is grace and peace to you. Now, the idea of peace, eirene, in the Greek would mean cessation of againstness. There is no againstness. It's all about someone being for you, not against you. Mm-hmm. And so, when I look at this, he says, to all in Rome who are loved by God, number one. Number two, and called. And so if we read later on what he means by called, how many people are called? Some or all?
He's called everyone. Yeah.
Exactly.
And there's a sense in which this even if you want to take God completely out of the context, it becomes irrelevant.
Exactly. And so the point that I'm trying to make, when you look at the entire document, it's not like, wow, he calls some and he leaves out others. Now, I understand that the term can be used differently, and it is, just to make different points. But in this kind of context, the kind of calling seems to be quite egalitaric. And so I wanted to make the point that in chapter 8, Paul's idea concerning those who are called, they are essentially also justified, and they are also glorified. And so to say that any of the people that we're talking about who God foreknew or loved would be left out of the equation would be ridiculous. And so whatever chapter 1 says, we have to keep this in light of the entire picture or plot, if you will.
Right.
Okay. And so my point is, this becomes maybe a story about love. Maybe this becomes a story about approach, maybe about a perspective or two. And these are some of the points that I wanted to make. Also, if we turn in a Bible, if you have a Bible like mine, let's turn to chapter 11 of this same book and make a further point. Did you have a comment to make before we go further?
Not really, other than I was going to say back when we were talking about justified, basically in contrast to the way that we human beings in our cultures tend to find fault with those who are a little different. And so when, those whom God called, he did this, he did that, and among those things he does is to justify them. God is not having a problem with those of you who are having a problem with others, and he's not having a problem with the others you're having a problem with.
Right. I would agree with Dr. Huddleston. I don't think that Moses was actually a person who existed. Neither do I think that Abraham was an individual who actually existed, that is, in the sense that the story is about. I think these stories were simply, fabricated, made up. And I think there is enough that has been put on the table to draw those kind of conclusions. And I would advocate people simply to check out the works of Dr. Huddleston. He's an excellent scholar. John Huddleston is his name. But, this person that we call Paul, he had these experiences, if you will. And so he's writing actually to those in Rome. And when we look at chapter 11, which is a complex, or it's typically a chapter that people don't want to get into. People love to avoid 9, 10, and 11 because it talks about, this predestination issue, and it talks about elect, it talks about leaving out some, including some. But at the end of the day, this is what's being stated in chapter 11, verse 28. Now, I want to let the people know who are listening that Bob and I didn't talk before the show as to what we were going to say. This is just from the hip. And we did this simply to be extremely honest because we want to see if we're actually coming to the same conclusions. And we wanted to do this on air this way. So verse 28, let's look at it together. Now, we're simply using a model of the text, no more than a model. As far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies on your account, but as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. Now let's read this carefully. For God's gifts in his call are irrevocable, just as you who were at one time disobedient to God have now received mercy as a result of their disobedience. So they too have now become disobedient in order that they too may now receive mercy as a result of God's mercy to you. Verse 32, for God has bound all men over to disobedience, that he may have mercy upon them all. Now, in the context, we're talking about several things. And he goes through this complexity between Jew and Gentile, and then he basically tries to wrap this up as to say that all people, both on the side of the uncircumcision and the side of the circumcision group, both parties were given over to the same thing in a sense, and all will receive this mercy. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. And of course, the sense I get from this is that so Paul is saying, okay, hey, God knows nobody's perfect. So, let's not all get hung up on this stuff.
So when it comes to giving people over to something, would we acknowledge that this particular portion of chapter 11 would say we've all been given over to something?
Sure.
Disobedience, definitely. Or whatever that might be.
We were back there in chapter 8.
Right. And so I don't think that we need to get so sensitive about chapter 1 if a particular group is given over to something. It doesn't mean that God is against us. Maybe there is a rationale here that Paul is trying to paint, hey, listen, God's not against you. He may be giving you over to what you want to do to see what the circumstances might be after the fact. Right. And so, simply put, there really isn't any condemnation in this context. Would you agree with that?
Definitely not. And in fact, Paul seems to be, or the writer here, seems to be making an argument for the fact that we're caught up in a lot of us versus them. But the argument here is that, let's pull this apart. Let's look at the implications of us versus them. This isn't working. It's just not an honest approach to the reality that we find ourselves in as in the human condition. This us versus them isn't going to work for various reasons, and so this is basically a lot of the argument that's being made. And what he does here, when we go back to chapter 1, we're going to take a look at some of the problems that we might have that cause us to think that there really is some legitimacy to the us versus them.
I agree. Yeah. And so when we go back to chapter 1, verse 7, when he makes the statement to all in Rome who are loved by God and called, we need to keep between the left and the right ear that Paul is trying to suggest to people, in a sense, everyone that God foreknew, he predestined, called, justified, and glorified. And so we don't need to jump off the cliff and say, oh, we're going to hell or anything like that. And so I would encourage people to be patient as we're trying to understand this particular writing. Let's move right along. In verse 17, and this comes up often, it says, "For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." Now, both of us have basically heard a lot of that kind of doctrine. I don't agree with it. But what is your understanding concerning this passage?
Well, first of all, I think that the argument being presented here is that, we're grabbing for this, of course, this concept of righteousness is, in my opinion, a bit too much hyperbole. But, can we, so who's wrong here? Where do we put the blame? What's going on? We're finding that the gospel here is a gospel of blamelessness. It's a gospel that from the very first person to the very last is, or from the very beginning of understanding it to the end of understanding it, is something that that has to do with what life is really all about. But I'm avoiding the way that it gets used here in the entire context of continuing the false argument of an us versus them.
Right, I agree with you, and I did not have my little teaching desk, but I wanted to come over to the board because I want to write this out on the board. He uses the preposition ek. He says ek pisteos, and then he puts the preposition eis here. And then he says eis, and then he goes to the term again, pistin.
Yeah. Are they able to send me a picture of you so that I can see this?
I'm going to ask them to do so. They're shaking their head no. We're having too many complications here. Okay. So let me just read it to you, Bob. I have simply written on the board, ek pisteos, eis pistin. This is the verse 17. And oftentimes, people like the translators of the King James Version, they translated this from faith to faith. And so the interesting thing is this particular preposition, because we're talking about this righteousness, if you will, and it's in reference to actually the euangelion, which would be the gospel. And it could be understood, that is, in the context of Paul, that Paul is saying that out of pisteos, whatever this term might mean, I would argue that it's not faith. Many people have stated that this is from, they take more of the ablative idea from faith to the preposition faith here. And please understand for those of you who are just studying Greek, this right here, this particular portion of the term just states basically this is not in the same case. And don't think that these are two different terms. These are just placed differently, syntactically speaking. And so the morphological elements are different. And so in the genitive here, what we do is, or we could use the 8-case system and say, well, the ablative is suggesting that this is something from or possibly out of. And so let's explore this. If we say that the revelation, that which is revealed from God, this righteousness, namely this gospel, is out of faith. In other words, where does revelation come from? Is it out of pisteos? In other words, where is it coming from? Is it coming from God, or is it coming out of faith? And the Protestant reformers would argue that faith is 100% a gift of God. It doesn't come from you, but it comes externally into us. This is why many people would argue faith comes by hearing of the word of Christ, not the word of God. That's very interesting to talk about, because Why did Paul shift gears? It's no longer so much the God issue, but it's the Christ issue. But that would be a subsequent teaching. So when I'm looking at this, Bob, can you see me now?
I can, yes.
Okay. So when we look at this, the question would be, is this revelation of righteousness and or the gospel, is this coming out of faith, or pisteos, to be technical? I would suggest that this is not from faith to faith, but actually from perspective
Exactly,
to
yes.
perspective. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. There's a way that I'm making sense of things today. And tomorrow I will, as I grow and as I evolve, I'll be making sense of things a little differently. In my life, I grow up and I mature and I develop an insight and an understanding so that my perspective over my lifetime is in a constant state of change. And during that constant state of change, this is what I see that it is talking about. What do I think is true? How do I make sense of reality? What do I make sense of God? All this, as I go through that process of life, even as I go through various changes, this is what it's talking about. That's what it's talking about.
I so agree. And it sounds like you would agree with this, that it's out of this, the makings, namely of the perspective, this is where revelation comes from, not directly from God himself. Would you agree with that? No.
Yes, yeah. The revelation comes from the experience. It's kind of like an unfolding of things start making more sense to you as time goes on, and or at least it seems to.
I think the Apostle Paul is attempting to be extremely honest in the text, and I think that this is the reason that he uses terms like he does. Or he did actually in verse 17 when he says "dekao osune." In other words, he's not talking so much about being righteous as he is in being honest with how he is receiving things. In other words, how I form my perspective of things, this is what we need to be talking about. And so how and what shapes my perspective. I would even go so far as
to say that this word means... and it's not to say that everything is perfect, but it's saying, I don't find fault in this process.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so if we could, in a sense, just for the sake of argument, maybe Paul is attempting to model something like this. I'm willing to move from one perspective to another. And I realize that out of my perspective comes many things. And so it's something that we just do. And so I find that that's basically what he's modeling. In light of that, let's move to verse 18. Now, many people would say, well, this is the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven. I don't agree with that. Orge is the term. When we say orge theou, it's not always to be construed as wrath.
No.
In this context, I think we're talking about the passion of God. For if we read all of the text...
when you hear something and you have a reaction to it, this is what it's talking. When it has an impact upon you, this word can even be used for both positive and negative impacts. But nonetheless, it really hits you.
God reminds me of you, Bob, because you're so passionate right now. And so, you get passionate about the text, you get passionate about argument, you get passionate about, just people gathering together for the interest of trying to support gay and lesbian community. This is wonderful. And so I don't look at this as the wrath of God in any sense. It's not about againstness, because why would he place as the premise of his text grace and peace? The whole idea of peace is cessation of againstness. And you're not going to try to share a gospel with people. Oh, the good news is God is against you. Damn you. No, he's saying, hey, listen, let's erase the notion of againstness. God isn't against anyone. He's passionate, and he certainly will let you do what you want to do. But sometimes he may jump in and try to help, that is, us to figure out what's best and what's not.
Yeah. And also, it begins here by, the wrath of God is being revealed. This is really theocentric here in terms of the way that it's being translated, when really what you've just been talking about, how, we're going from perspective to perspective. And now an argument is about ready to be made by Paul or the writer here about how some of these perspectives fell apart within our history and within our culture. And he's about ready to talk about that. And so there's a sense here in which, when I read this verse and I try to, you're far more experienced with the Greek than I am, but I get the impression that basically when I read this verse, I'm getting the feeling that it might be better to state it this way. By looking around, it's obvious to see how God must feel about mankind's lack of respect and injustice held stubbornly in the midst of truths.
Right.
This is the way that I see this verse. And when I take the hyperbole out of it and I look at the structure and try to put it in the context of the things that Paul is already talking about, which is the history or the panorama of our perspectives as we go through time and go through life.
I look at Paul as a naturalist. I think that what he's going to do in this particular passage, he's going to make an argument for not naturalism, but what he would understand as that which was natural. And I'm going to state this. It was natural for a man and a woman to love one another. And in Paul's world, it was quite natural for two men to fall in love and love one another. And it was quite natural for two women to fall in love and love one another. That was natural. What Paul is getting ready to deal with in this kind of context, he's going to compare two different things. He's going to compare, first of all, the natural with that which is unnatural. Now, I realize that Christianity has come along and that they have tried to articulate that two men together is unnatural. That's not what Paul's saying. Christianity has tried to pontificate that two women coming together and having this wonderful relationship, that's not natural. And see, I would argue that Paul would say that is as dumb as shit could be. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, although I tell you, when it comes to that particular section here in Romans 1, I don't see Paul talking about sex.
I agree. I completely agree with that.
He's not talking about sex here.
Exactly.
He's talking about, it's one could argue that it's far more natural that we should love each other than that we should be enemies.
I so agree.
And that part of what so maybe I misunderstood what you're saying. And so what I'm looking at here as he's building this up, it is translated in a very pernicious and dishonest way to make it sound like we're going to talk about how these women are unnaturally having this passion towards each other, when the words used here are indexical. And maybe we can explain this later. But they're indexical of a social context, not a sexual context.
Exactly.
And what we're talking about here is women who are not getting along with each other in a way that would really be more natural for women to get along with each other. And that's what it's talking about. It's not talking about sexuality at all.
I so agree. My point about sexuality has to do with what Christian theology has been pushing. And so this is something that we have to address. And I want people to feel comfortable in this conversation to say, wow, in Christianity, based upon some of the models that I've read, and people have been speaking about this issue for a long, long time, they have made this about sex. And this has absolutely nothing to do with sex at all.
It
and
has
you
nothing
would
to do
agree
with
with
sex.
that, Bob?
In fact, if anything, it has to do with the problem of testosterone. My sister Barb is often complaining about the penchant that men have towards violence. Unlike I think women can be violent too, but men seem to really like a good fight.
Right. And so let's go back to what I was talking about when Paul is this person and he's having to deal with what took place in times past. I don't even think, and we can read the book of Romans this morning, but that would take quite some time, so we're not going to do that. But in reading all of this, it seems like from some English translations that Paul would be in agreement with some of these writers or people of the past. And when we look at other English translations, for instance, Dr. Ann Nyland's work, it would be understood much differently, and it's simply because we're working with different models. So my argument would be that, first of all, in verse 18, we're not talking about the wrath of God, but we're talking about the passion of God.
Yes.
And we're not talking about heaven, quote unquote, where the streets of gold are, but we're simply talking about wherever God might be, that is, in theological jesting.
Well, even in the Bible, that word is translated like the birds of the air. We're just talking about anything that's above the ground.
Exactly.
And sometimes it's even used philosophically in that day to talk about the universe or everything. You know?
In other words, wherever God is, that's heaven.
There's,
whether you put it,
could even make a linguistic argument that there's no such thing as heaven in the New Testament.
I would agree. Now, verse 20 states, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse." I would argue that this is where Paul really gets particular about using our senses. In other words, we can look around.
And I think this is translated in a way that leads us astray from what the point here seems to me to be. And that is, we're looking at a lot of prepositions, and these prepositions are somewhat dangling. Would you agree with that?
I agree.
So that depending on what we assign them to in the context here, this could be taken a variety of different ways, and we might not have, here's one of those things that you talk about, we might not have enough deictic information to tell us exactly how we should put these phrases together and these prepositions applied. Because I'll tell you what, here I see Paul really arguing that we have this reality that we're looking at, and some of the things in this reality are solid and material, and we can see what's made, and other aspects of reality are kind of invisible. Things like concepts, ideas, notions, thought, being, things like this are invisible, and that he's really just attributing all of this as having been brought to us through creation by God.
Right.
And so it's that's what I see he's working into myself in terms of where he's going to go with this argument.
When I look at the Greek text, one of the things that I would make an argument for is that Paul is, in this sense, making the point that through our senses we do perceive X, Y, and Z. And I think that this is why often the translators say, they can see clearly. It's what they are observing in life. That is,
we can draw
in nature.
Inferences from what we can see about things we don't see.
In other words, they're looking at nature. They're looking at things that are what we call reality. And so that's simply the only point that I wanted to make in that particular verse. And I'm not trying to go so quick, not to be thorough. I'm just trying.
When I look at the trees, I understand beauty.
Exactly.
When I look at the, and things like that, yes.
Right. So he said, being understood from what has been made. In other words, the observation of that which has been made. Not that Paul is trying to argue, God actually created this. It could be stated that, once again, he's using God as a literary device simply to say, why don't you just stay in this natural world, look at it, perceive it, understand it in that sense, and not try to go outside of the boundaries of naturalism, if I can use that term.
Yeah, we can draw some conclusions just from the experience of what we observe.
Verse 21, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but in their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds, animals, and reptiles." And so the point that I want to make here is this. What is the problem here? Is it a sexual thing? No, it's idolatry. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. And in fact, the way I would even see it as mistranslate here, it's like, well, it's almost like he's saying, although they thought they knew God, they don't know God. They got the wrong God. They kind of got mixed up here.
True. Now, one of the things that I would like to say is that I really advocate Dr. Ann Nyland's work. I can't say that enough, simply because one of the things that she keeps saying is this is a context for idolatry. In fact, when we continue to read, we can read the next verse. Therefore, God gave them over in the sexual, or excuse me, not sexual, but in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, which is a horrible translation here, for degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Now, the term lie is metonymy. In other words, it's a replacement word. In other words, the Apostle Paul is playing and tossing words around in order to get people to understand something. We're
talking about truth versus...
Well, actually, in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 30, if one would read that context, the same kind of concept is being argued. And it's simply a case of, once again, this idolatry. And so I would say that an idol and a lie would be almost one and the same in this context. And so when it says, therefore, God gave them over, as we read early in the program, God gave all of us over to certain things, not so he would damn us, but to simply have mercy on us all. And so God, in the context that Paul is spinning, is not a God of condemnation, but one working resolve that is within us or with us, if that makes sense.
We are in a boat together, as it were, and we are all struggling to make sense of these things, and we're all kind of given up to that subjective experience that does lack a great deal of the kind of clarity we'd love to nail down, and this is what we're given up to.
Right. Now let me read this from Dr. Nyland's work, verse 21. Let me go back to verse 21. And this is why, although they perceived God, they didn't praise him as God or even thank him. Rather, their reasoning became useless, and their stupid minds were darkened and obscured. They alleged that they were wise, but they became fools. They exchanged the splendor of the imperishable God for an image made like a perishable person, not to mention images of birds and four-legged animals and even reptiles. And so these people are into ritualistic things. They're into ceremonial things. They're getting into things that are outside of naturalism, in a sense. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and even there's a sense here which we're almost talking about the over-anthropomorphic views.
Right. And so when I read the NIV, which I think really insults people, therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity. Let me read Dr. Ann Nyland's work here. For this reason, God handed them over to ritual uncleanness. Doesn't have anything to do with sexuality. It has to do with the rituals that these people were performing based upon their idolatry. There's a big difference here.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and of course, even if you wanted to be more traditional, the concept here is simply impurity, without necessarily describing what kind of impurity.
Exactly.
So it's just gotten ourselves a little bit muddy.
So if we continue her thoughts, once again, so for this reason God handed them over to ritual uncleanness in their minds, wants, wishes, so that their bodies would be dishonored with each other. Verse 25, they exchanged God's truth for the lie, which according to her, and I'm going to read from her work, she suggests that this is metonymy, a substitution of a word describing the nature of significance of an object instead of the object itself. Paul here equates the lie with the idol. Isaiah
Right.
talks of an idol as a lie, and we can confer Isaiah 44:20. And so I'm proud that she did include this in her work.
Right. Can I add something here about the bodies here? Paul has already talked about the things that we see helping us to infer things that we can't see. And so when he's talking about dishonoring our bodies, he's talking about, can you see another human being in their body? And are we dishonoring by failing to make proper inferences about the fact that they are there? Kind of like contrasted with Jesus, saying, how about loving your neighbor? And so if you can see the person, you now know, oh, there's my neighbor. So the body here, and of course, as we say, this gets translated as if it's talking about sex, but Paul here is really just arguing about the fact that the actual undeniable fact that we are not alone, that there are other people around. You can see them, their bodies are right there in front of you. This is really, I see, the focus of where this particular verse is trying to draw our attention.
Now, in verse 26, she translates it this way, and some of the stuff that she has done is based upon, and I must say, it's based upon direct modeling or a direct technique of translation theory, not the oblique. And so some of this fails to really grasp the point. But this portion I really do like. She says, because of this, God handed them over to experiences of public stigma. In other words, this placed them
awesome.
to the category of something that was being, in a sense, in the public eye. And so when we go back and look at the culture to think that this is an issue of, wow, this is going to be a stigma because this is homosexuality, that would be ridiculous, especially when we have studied the culture. And so,
of course, I don't think she's talking about. I don't think we're talking about homosexuality here in this text at all.
I so agree. But my point is, if we model this as homosexuality, to place that in that kind of context would be ridiculous.
Yeah, and of course, it's kind of like basically, I like the way she put this. I've not read Ann Nyland's work. I'm going to have to get a hold of it because I've heard you talk about her often. But that we kind of get given up to the what it is we happen to be feeling and thinking at the time, and just kind of running with it, and we end up dishonoring each other when we do that. It's kind of like the knee-jerk reaction of life, the knee-jerk reaction of interaction with each other.
I agree. So we've gone through 26. I'm going to go back to the NIV, simply to be fair to those people who say, oh, this is a better model, or I could read from the King James Version. Let's go back to the King James Version theology, verse 27. And likewise, also the men leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lusts one toward another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meet. And so, what are your thoughts on that particular verse?
I see this as talking about how, first of all, when it was talking about the women exchange natural. Now, it doesn't say. Like the NIV says, they exchange natural sexual relations for their unnatural ones. I'm sorry, that's not what it says. In fact, the word there is more indexically associated with the cultural norms of how women are to deal with women. And then we come over here to verse 27, and the way I understand this, the author here is talking about how, we men, we get together, and instead of being, proper men, what do? We we want what the other guy has. We say, hey, my lust for possessions, my lust for power, my lust for land, I'll tell you what, man is going to now come against man, and this lust that we're talking about is not the lust of sexuality, but the lust of greed, the lust of insecurity. And so that what we end up doing is that these shameful acts is the way we treat each other. We go to war, we mug each other, we become thieves, we kill each other on the road. And as a result, there are many people who are alive, particularly even in Paul's day, who bear on their bodies the scars of crime and war and the horrible ways in which we can behave and treat each other because of our tremendous greed and lust for more power, for more possessions, for more influence or whatever. And so that's what I am seeing here in verse 27.
I so agree with you. This is a passage, in my opinion, that needs a lot of treatment, and I would like to do that possibly next week when we have a little bit more time.
Yeah,
because I want people to understand that this is not in the context that has been taught for the most part in church. And so when we look at the Greek text, what you're talking about is so true. It's talking about something completely different than how the church has been approaching this.
Right. Yes. Did I just lose you here? Or no, you're just...
No, I'm trying
the sound
to take a drink.
Yeah. It's a shame because... now, I don't know how Nan Nyland translated verse 27 there, but,
I can read that.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Okay. Now, I don't agree with what she did in 27, and I have various reasons that I want to make at a particular time. But let me finish up verse 26 of her translation. For the females exchange natural sex for what is other than nature. And the same goes for males too. The males got rid of natural sex with the female and burned with mutual yearning. Males producing indecency with one another, and as a result got what was coming to them for their mistake. Now, to be fair to Dr. Nyland, she makes the statement, and has made the statement very, very clear. These Greek verses are talking about things that are next to impossible to transport in English. And since she is using direct technique modeling, for instance, if you read the preface of her translation work, excuse me for a second.
The word, while you're doing the word lust here it's a wide and a very broad word, but also the word natural is a very wide and broad word in terms of how it gets applied. And in many ways, when it was used in this way, when we're talking about natural relations, we're talking about culture.
True. Let me read something about what she does with verse, let's say, 28. They did not think it fit to acknowledge God, so he gave them an unfit mind. Now, other translations will say a depraved mind. Other translations will go even further than that. Now, let me read basically what she's saying concerning this. Now, it's actually held in a footnote if you have her work. She states, Paul loves to play on words, and here the word play cannot be brought out in English. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, if you're talking about this term, it's simply something that is scrutinizing. It's to put something to the test, like putting gold to the test, if you will. So they put God to the test and decided not to acknowledge him. As a result, God put them to the test, and they did not pass. And in other words, God was simply wanting these individuals not to go into the context of rituals and idolatry. And so if you're going to do that, let me put you to the test. Let's shift, the mirror in a sense. Let's see what you're mirroring, and maybe you can see for yourself, what's wrong with the picture or your paradigm. And so, once again, to keep this in context, the entire context of chapter 1 for the most part, is all about idolatry. And it
Could
has to...
I say something here that I think is also the flavor of this play on words? Let me create another play on the same concepts here. We have evangelicals and fundamentalists who are using a direct modeling in translating that is also highly connected to their traditional doctrines rather than and to root meanings here that they just don't have any real background in making these kinds of assertions as they translate. It's kind of like saying, okay, so you're translating the text. Well, now that you've translated, let me ask you this. Are you really qualified to do this? And so there's a sense here which, man tests, that which he can see and comes up and ends up abandoning certain ideas. But are we really even qualified to do that?
Well, according to what she's saying is, and I'm simply reading this because so many people will think that, you and I are simply making this stuff up as we go along, and that's nothing could be further from the truth. Dr. Ann Nyland is being extremely careful, and she's simply saying that this, in a sense, is not translatable. That is, and I'm paraphrasing here or inputting some things that she did not say. If we use direct technique modeling, but if we do use a different kind of modeling that would give us an idea, we could come to something that would be similar to, but it would take many more words. Therefore, we could not, swap adjective for adjective, noun for noun, verb for verb. And so there is much to say about this, in which we will get into. But let's move on a little bit further down the road in this, because this is quite interesting. They have been, verse 29, they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Now, this is from Protestant modeling. It's not what I would agree with, but once again, I want to be fair to both sides of the coin.
Doesn't this, as the context, say, okay, what are we talking about having given them up? What kind of impurity are we talking about? What kind of lusts are we talking about?
Exactly.
Well, let me give you a list and be very clear exactly what I'm talking about. And here are the lists of the shameful acts.
Exactly. As we continue in the text, chapter 2 makes a wonderful point. You, therefore, have no excuse. So he's talking to all of these people loved by God in Rome. He doesn't know all of these people personally. He's just suggesting everyone here is included in this particular target. That is the target of his writing here. And he said, you therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge the other, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. So
is there a difference in anybody's story? Sure, we've kind of missed the point at some point, each of us, and just maybe in different ways and in different cultural contexts. So, okay, what's the difference?
Exactly. So in chapter 2, the first part of it, it's like he's saying, now, here's what's going on in a sense. We have no excuse, but at the same time, we have to realize that all of us have been participating in the very thing that I've been talking about or writing about.
Exactly.
And so this is not about homosexuality versus heterosexuality and which one is right, which one is wrong. That has nothing to do with it. This is talking about all people being loved by God, who are called by God, even to go so far as to say they've been predestined, they've been justified, they've been glorified. And all of us will have mercy on us just because we are who we are, period. As we continue to read, verse 2 says, now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based upon truth. So when you, a mere man, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think that you will escape God's judgment? And so he does not, he's not suggesting that all people are not guilty of the same thing. He's actually suggesting that everyone has the same problem as the people that he's writing about. Would you agree with this?
Definitely, and yeah, as I was even trying to say before, trying to make that clear, that we will all perceive different things, come to different conclusions, but we're all kind of fumbling in a little bit of darkness. We're all because of our insecurities and our stubbornness. We've all chosen a path we thought we could get away with. We've all really dismissed the value of our neighbor in different ways, so if I'm going to start now, he's not saying. Let's be clear. He's not saying. So let's not find that there's anything wrong in what we're doing. He's not saying that. A lot of these things are shameful. We're even talking about. We're acknowledging that there's a clarity of judgment upon this in a sense. But what we're saying is this: don't think you can take this to the point of condemning somebody.
Exactly. And yeah. I think that in verse 4 he makes the very point that you're making. He says, "Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness?" Now, is Paul trying to spin that this is the anger and the wrath of God and he's pissed off at these people? Or is he saying, do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, tolerance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness leads you toward repentance or changing your mind? And in other words, in the text, is he talking about something that's good and healthy and something that's beneficial for those people who he's giving over to X, Y, or Z in the context, whether it's a ritual thing or what? But in this context, it's very ritualistic.
We've already talked about moving from perspective to perspective.
Exactly.
And guess what? There is time. The reaction of the universe to our stupidity is not, well, let me throw a bolt of lightning at you and fry you where you stand. The reaction of the universe is more, you got more time, let's continue to work on this.
So it becomes obvious in the text that it's the goodness of God, it's this kindness of God, it's this gentleness, this patience.
In light of the problems that we have, there's still this kindness and gentleness in light of it.
So if we can understand this, is Paul trying to spin a God notion of the law? It's being held over you, it's judging you, critically so, it's trying to damn you. Or is he trying to say, let's erase the notions of the law?
Oh, and maybe definitely. He's trying to get rid of it. He's trying to tell us that. In fact, I think he's going to get into other arguments where he's going to say, part of what's messed us up in all this is the religion. Part of what's messed us up in this are all those obtuse, incorrect, idolatrous God notions, and that he's really trying to strip us of that, because as a result of it, look where it's gotten every single one of us.
Would it be safe to say that God gives us over to whoever we are so we can figure out what's right and wrong about it for us?
Sure. I mean, take your time. I think we're encouraged to recognize and think clearly and take responsibility and discover what where love is. In fact, I even see Jesus as kind of mocking the concept of law. Oh, you like commandments, you like laws? Okay, here's a new commandment. Why don't you love one another? And so yeah, I see this definitely though. And getting back to your previous statement there, Paul is trying to erase all of this. He's trying to push it aside. He's trying to show that if you really want this, where does it lead you? It leads you to just being further along, abandoned to these shameful things, and end up just condemning one another. Okay, what good is that?
Exactly. That's good. When you look at Romans chapter 3, Paul makes this comment. He said, what if some did not have faith? In other words, what if some people are atheists? They don't even believe in God. Will their lack of faith nullify God's faithfulness? Paul comes back to this and says, not at all. Let God be true. Let God be who he is, and every man a liar.
Are you suggesting that belief is optional?
I think that belief is what it is. We react to things differently. We have,
the issue.
Yeah, it's a non-issue for Paul. This has nothing to do with who you believe in, what you believe, what your preference is, or who you are. And this is why I keep saying we need to support the gay and lesbian community and show them that these writers, they are not against them, but they are actually saying, we have problems just like everyone else does. We have a perspective, and feel free enough to be who you are, naturally speaking.
Paul built us a wooden ladder, as it were, and we've pulled the ladder apart and whittled it away until we've come up with a bunch of spears. And Paul is trying to undo a certain concept within the passages we've gone through. And what we've done is we've tried to rebuild and reaffirm in our stubbornness. In fact, I would say we've suppressed the truth in our own stubborn againstness to take this text that Paul had given us, and we try to turn it into the exact opposite of what he was trying to tell us.
Exactly. We're going to have someone on the show tonight, and this person's going to come out of the closet for the first time. And we talked with this person yesterday, and it was powerful, because it's been one of these things. I'm trying to be true to myself. I've had to live a lie, in a sense, to other people, and I've had to hide, behind closed doors. And I'm so thankful that this person is willing now to come out of the closet, because this person doesn't feel condemnation. They feel like they can be who they are and not be fake. This is why I keep saying that Paul, in a sense, is a naturalist. He wants you to be you, whoever you might be. If you're a heterosexual, so be it. If you're a lesbian, a gay, so be it. Enjoy life for who you are. Don't try to don't allow these ritualistic notions and all of this stuff try to push you in one direction or another. Simply be who you are, and that would be authentically you.
Yeah. If I could kind of paraphrase and invent my own scripture here, the passion of Bob is revealed here against all the absurd traditions of human beings who are trying to push this concept of againstness. And I'll tell you something. It in some ways it actually angers me when I see that there's an entire class of people who are not allowed, or who are treated in such a horrible manner that they can't take a healthy pride in being who they are. That they're somehow forbidden or given shame for just being, in essence, who and what they are, when Paul has already told us that, we're all moving from perspective to perspective. We're all making mistakes. This condemnation concept isn't working for you. And there's a sense in which, you've all been given up to that anyway. So, as a result, the end result of this all is, we're going to make this reconcile. We're going to work it all out together. And that's the good news, And so I'll tell you, these people are holding on to this tradition. It angers me, the ignorance and the hatred that is represented by trying to push this concept, particularly in the dishonest way that sexuality is placed into Romans chapter 1, where it doesn't belong.
I so agree. Tonight we're going to be dealing with the same subject, and it's going to be more of a conversation with people, especially our audience. We want people to ask questions. And Bob Graves is going to be with us tonight. He's part of the show every Sunday night. And we also will have someone coming out of the closet, as I stated before. And this is going to be ever so good. And so be with us tonight. I'd also like to state this. I'm going to put on the table a translation that I think that would be useful for all of you guys who want to support equality. And so hopefully we can continue this series in a meaningful way. And please understand, we we really don't have a reason to bash people. We have every reason in the world to love people. Let's allow people to be who they are, accept them for who they are. It's not just about love, it's about acceptance.
So disappointed. I'm so disappointed with some of the things that are part of my own past. Far be it from me to then therefore be disappointed with somebody else who's also stumbling through life.
Right. I agree. You know, one of the things before this show, I've received a lot of flack for even bringing the subject up. And this is troubling. This is 2014, and some people are still living back as if, you know, women need to be bought and treated like chattel in marriage.
Grow up!
Yeah, it's crazy. And
Get
so,
with it.
at some point, you know, we need to say no to all of this nonsense. And today is the day in which people need to feel good about who they are. So if you find someone that you're in love with, or whatever the case might be, regardless of what the sex might be, feel good about who you are and that ability to simply be able to love and accept that individual.
It's so wonderful to have somebody you can be very close to share your struggles with, to get to see their struggles. I'll tell you what, you know, I've been married for 25 years, and I met this woman at a time when as I'm falling in love with her, as I'm beginning to admire who she is as a human being, I found the day just came when I wanted to see how this story progresses. I want to see how it ends, you know. And what a blessing it's been to my life to have somebody in my life where we've been together and able to experience this and go through these difficulties and challenges of life together. It's been a wonderful blessing. I can't imagine forbidding that to anybody who can have that involved in a manner that is so meaningful to them. You know, it's awesome.
I agree with you, Bob. It was great to have you on this morning.
Glad to be here.
We will see you guys tonight. Take care.